Major support for these broadcasts is provided by New York Community Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chelsea Lighting, Capital One Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Genova Burns, Giantomasi and Webster, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, the Wyckoff Group, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank. Additional support is provided by Ackman Ziff Real Estate Group, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, C.B. Richard Ellis, Colliers International New York, LLC, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, DDG Partners, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Flushing Bank, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Centurion Holdings, John Katsimatidis, Red Apple Group, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, New Banks, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Sterling and Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, and These Friends.
Her name is Lynn Brooks. She's the founder of Big Apple Greeters, and she has a fantastic life. And more important, she's a native New Yorker, born in Manhattan. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
So, I always like going back to relatives. You told me that your great-grandfather came over near the Civil War time?
I have sitting on my wall in my apartment his citizenship papers, which are very tiny. They're maybe 4 by 6. When he was admitted, when he became a citizen prior to the Civil War, I think it was 1858.
He was in the tobacco business? He was a tobacco salesman, did you tell me?
That's what they told me.
So
I obviously didn't know him.
No, I didn't think you knew him. Okay, so he was a tobacco salesman. And, then moving on a little bit, that your father, you said to me, was an attorney, correct?
My father was an attorney. He practiced in New York City. He was
a
trial lawyer.
A trial attorney. So tell me about your childhood.
I lived on mostly the west side of Manhattan. I went to Julia Richmond High School.
And you told me when we got together, what was interesting about your childhood is that your mother had been deceased when you were young, and your stepmother and your dad had this, they always, to save money or something, it was like every 2 years they would move to a new apartment.
Well, in those days, October 1st was moving day in Manhattan, and everybody moved on October 1st, and they moved because the landlord in the new apartment would give you a month's free rent, or maybe more than a month, but the motivation for moving was to save money.
Now, in most cases, you stayed on the Upper West Side, with the exception of once you ended up in Forest Hills.
Once we moved to Forest Hills, and that was to save even more money, because rents were cheaper in Forest Hills than they were in Manhattan, just as they are today.
But then you subsequently moved back.
We were there for 2 years, and then we moved back.
And you're a junior at Julia Richmond High School, and then you decide to go to college, and you said to me, since a lot of people from the war were coming back from World War II, including your husband, who's been a guest on my show, it was difficult to get into a school in New York City.
was difficult to get into a school, period.
Period. So how do you find this college in Pennsylvania?
Just like kids find colleges today, you get some guidance, you do some research, and it wasn't anything major.
Where in Pennsylvania?
But it was in Pittsburgh, but I was only there for a year, and it wasn't a very important part of my life. But then I transferred back to Hunter College, and I went to Hunter, and I graduated from Hunter.
And you majored in?
Sociology and psychology.
Now, while you were Hunter, in your last year, you had a year of a volunteer job, correct?
No, in my last year, I had an honors job. Rather than taking a course, I did research for what was then called the Department of Welfare, which is now called Social Services.
And you gained a little insight on the payment of welfare checks and everything else.
And that's what I did.
So you graduate, and then what do you do?
Well, then I got a job with the Department of Welfare working in the first senior citizen center.
Right, the Golden Age Center.
That's what they called it in those days, up in the Bronx. And I ran discussion groups and put on plays and was a group leader until I met my husband. And
now, you told me your husband, truly the legendary radio voice, Stan Brooks of 1010 Wins, my colleague over there. You met Stan at a square dance. Now, you also told me, which Stan didn't tell me when I interviewed him, is that you were going out with someone for about 3 years, and you had broken up, right?
That's true.
And so where'd you meet Stan in the square dance? Where was the square dance?
It was down at the Henry Street Settlement House. I had never been there before. He had never been there before.
He was a guy from the Bronx. You were a person from Manhattan.
Right.
So
it was kismet.
It was
we met, and it was kismet.
Right, and then a couple months later you get married?
3 months later we got engaged, 3 months later we got married, and ultimately went hitchhiking in Europe.
And as Stan told me, and you mentioned it also, what happened was you decided that since you knew you were going to Europe, you took your wedding presents and you utilized the wedding presents for this 6-month trip to Europe, right? It was like a
3-month trip.
3-month trip to Europe where you hitchhike and you gain some insight. So then you come back, and where's the next job?
Well, then I came back, and Stan was not working at 1010 Wins. He was working at Newsday.
He was
working at Newsday.
Newsday at that time.
And he was working nights. I definitely didn't want to work days and have him work nights. I saw myself as, the shiny kitchen floors, white sheets hanging on the lawn, Jude and Allison image, and so I took a bunch of little nothing jobs, and then we had kids.
And then you moved to Cedarhurst.
Then we moved to the Five Towns on Long Island.
And there you got involved with the local temple, the local public school, where you got involved with some community services.
I got very deeply involved with the civil rights movement at that point through our local community council, and worked on many issues related to what was going on vis-a-vis black-white issues and problems of the day.
Then the kids get older, and then it's time for you to say, enough of this volunteer, you want to go back to work on a regular job. And so what's the job?
Well, the first job I got was doing research for a social work agency. Really didn't relate to the civil rights issues, but had to do with researching as to whether or not in this Queens area they might have to start worrying about drugs. Would that come in? And of course that came in very quickly. Shortly after I worked there, we moved to Washington, D.C., and I got a job for with the National Conference of Christians and Jews. We were there a short time, moved back to New York. I again got a job with
National
Conference of Christian
Jews in New York.
And was then working again with the kind of issues I really felt strongly about, which were human rights issues and people getting along with people and solving some of the racial issues of today and solving some of the women's issues, because that was also the beginning of Betty Friedan writing her book and middle-class women saying, what's going on here?
So national conference ends abruptly, perhaps? Some that's
You're referring to my having told you that I was fired. Yes, I was fired.
you know, it depends on the eloquence of how I determine. So you were fired, and then what do you do?
But I was fired because I was working on women's issues things, and that was very threatening. And I was told that was the reason I was fired. So that was a huge learning experience for me. It was probably one of the better things that ever happened to me. Went to graduate school, got a master's.
That's when you went to NYU?
Got my master's in human relations and social policy. Worked some more in race relations issues. Worked in the anti-poverty program of Johnson. Ended up at Adelphi University.
So let's talk about Adelphi. You get to Adelphi, and what do you do at Adelphi? Because you had an 8-year stint at Adelphi.
Adelphi, I was hired to be a counselor in an adult degree program. It was the first program in the nation that was targeting adult students. And that was extremely valuable, probably led to the rest of my careers, because ultimately we started a center of volunteerism at the university.
Now this was ABLE.
The name of the adult program was ABLE. It offered the opportunity for adult students to get credit for prior learning, but that prior learning could only have come from paid employment. And I kind of said, wait a minute, women may well have learned a lot, not in paid employment, but if they ran $1 million cookie program or some other thing, they would have learned as much as a man. And besides which, this is a market that the university was missing. So we developed a center on volunteerism, got a large grant from the Kellogg Foundation, ultimately gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about volunteerism, and probably ultimately led to where I am now, working with a large number of volunteers at Big Apple Greeter.
Adelphi was a Long Island institution, but they also had a New York City.
They did.
And you were involved with that. So you were a vice dean at Adelphi when you finally left?
No, I was an associate dean.
Associate dean. So you leave Adelphi, and then you decide to get involved with the travel with some island in the Caribbean?
Well, I always wanted to work in the travel industry, but I never had. The president of the university, who was Tim Costello at the time, was leaving. I was looking for another job. I had vacationed in this particular ecologically sound tent resort in St. John. I called up the owner of the resort and said, I'm leaving the university, I'm looking for a job. He hired me. It lasted for about 6 months, and then I went from there to the International Center in New York, which was a wonderful nonprofit.
Talk about the International Center.
Again, it was with volunteers, a large pool of volunteers who were matched with a immigrant, a refugee, a student, a business person, to practice English.
You know, once, a couple years ago, I had the life of the late Tony Goldman, who was involved with Soho. And what he always did was he bought 18 buildings. You know, as opposed to 8 years, he would develop 18 buildings because he felt 18 was high, long life. So the 8 years, you know, in the situation. So
it could have been 7 years, I won't.
Oh, okay. So what happens after the International Center?
I went and started Big Apple Greeter.
Which we'll get to, but you know, it's interesting because you were just, you know, you just won an award for an article which we'll talk about, you know, Center for Productivity in Life. Basically, the comment was, you know, people at certain ages should continue work. And you, at the age of 59, had a dream. And you had always learned from your tenacity and persistence that, you know, you'd call up people and write letters and you'd make an impression. And you had a dream for something which subsequently became Big Apple Greeter, interesting logo. But let's talk about the embryo. You're 59 years of age, you know. You have a very successful husband who's the voice of 1010 Wins, you know, the city report and everything else over his many years at Wins. He's the man who took it from rock and roll to 24-hour news. How do you think of creating Big Apple Greeter?
It was an idea I had in my mind for a very long time.
Explain what Big Apple Greeter does, and then talk about the difficulties, because thank God you met Ruth Messenger, who really was very responsible for this.
Absolutely. What we do, it's our 20th anniversary year, which is remarkable. We have about 300 volunteers, New Yorkers, who will spend half a day with a visitor coming into New York. So if you were coming in from California or you were coming in from Tokyo or France, you would, in today's world, find us on the web. You'd Google visiting New York and we'd pop up. And you would find out there's an application online. You'd fill it out. We'd get your name, your interests, what you'd like to do. And we would match you with no cost to you. It's free to the visitor. We would match you with a New Yorker who speaks the language you speak, who can show you the things that you're interested in. And it's New Yorkers show neighborhoods. It's not taking people to the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building, which are wonderful places to visit, but they can get to on their own. We want to help them to see the New York neighborhoods, to find out the essence of New York, to meet a real New Yorker and walk around a real New York neighborhood. So that's what Big Apple Greeter is all about.
Let's go to 1992. You have this idea. You have no money. You have no idea of how to start a nonprofit. I mean, you work for a number of nonprofits over the year, but that wasn't your expertise. And you were saying to me, you went to the telephone book, you made phone calls. Tell me about that and how you end up at Ruth Messenger's office.
Well, what I did is I sat with a typewriter at my dining room table, and I really didn't know how to type, so I had a good friend who helped me.
Was this the same friend who helped you later on because you know how to use a computer?
Exactly. Definitely the same friend. So I sat there and wrote letters to people that I had met through the years, because I had been the executive director of another nonprofit, because my husband is a reporter. So I could write letters to the mayor. I could write letters to the head of the Visitors and Convention Bureau, which is now called NYC and Company, to ABNY, the Association of the Better New York. I knew all these people, not necessarily well, but there was name recognition. And what I did was I wrote and said, this is an idea I have. This is why I think it would be good for New York. Remember, the times were terrible. And I felt if we didn't do something about the image of New York, nobody was going to come to New York.
We had the squeegee man. You know, we had other problems in the city in the early 90s. You know, economic conditions,
Exactly.
Lower Manhattan. Nobody wanted to be in any of the buildings.
Visitors wouldn't come. Businesses wouldn't come. It wouldn't be good for the banking industry. It wouldn't be good for the real estate. It wouldn't be good for anybody. We had to do something about that image of New York.
Did the hotel industry embrace this? I mean,
the answer to that is an interesting question. The hotel industry was the first industry that embraced it. But when I first had the idea, and I wrote the various movers and shakers, and I said, would you see me and give me some advice? Because I know most people will see you and give you advice. If you ask them for money or something else, maybe not. And everybody saw me. That was not a problem. And everybody said, Lynn, I think it's a wonderful idea, but it absolutely won't work, and you shouldn't do it for this and this and this reason. So I went on to the next person, and ultimately got to Ruth Messenger, who said, I think it's a wonderful idea. I can't pay you a salary, but I will give you a desk and a phone and the support of my office. And when you raise money and you start this program, then you can get a salary. So then the letters went out over Ruth Messenger's letterhead, which meant a lot more than going out over.
Which helped, but what the initial thing that really helped Big Apple Greeters was the publisher who gave you money.
Well, that was through Ruth.
Oh, right, but the idea was, I'm going to give you a project. I'm going to give you enough money for like 6 weeks' salary for you and an assistant or someone else. What was the project?
It was the publisher of Newsday, and he and Sulzberger from the New York Times were running a convention in New York City for publishers of newspapers, the ANPA convention. And he said, I think this would be a great place to kick off this program. I will give you enough money to hire somebody until this program happens, this conference, period. So that was the start. And then we had to scrounge for more money and more money. And
So where does the money come from now? You said to me you had one nice grant a couple of years ago or something.
well, this has been a wildly successful program.
I mean,
Volunteers, visitors.
Right. It's it's so successful that it basically started with one. If you want to say the plant seed, it started with New York City, and now you just came back from an international event of 36 cities who have the greeter program. In Australia was number 2. Now you're in Israel. You have Paris is the second biggest place, but how do you germinate from this little part-time job, the 6 weeks, to grow to, you have like 300 volunteers right now. You have 300 greeter volunteers, but you also have volunteers who work in the institution.
Exactly. It's amazing. It has never been a problem getting volunteers. New Yorkers love to do this, and they stay for a long time. So that's not a problem. Visitors pour in, that's not a problem. You hit on the difficult thing, and that's supporting the program financially. There are expenses to run any program. You can't run a program that has 7,000 visitors a year. We've done hundreds of thousands of visitors without having staff. You can't have 300 or 400 volunteers without having staff.
You have to coordinate the visits. You have to give them.
Exactly.
Now,
computers, business cards, stationery, the whole bit. So we have to raise that money. We do get some money from corporations. We do get some money from foundations. We do get some money from the city budget. But it's hard. We almost went out of business a few years ago, but we didn't, because Ariadne Getty on the West Coast saw a program that CNN did about this businesses having trouble in this hard economic time. We were included in that program. She called up and said, "I'd like to help you," from her Fuserna Foundation. That was wonderful. And she pledged $200,000 a year for 3 years. This is our last year, but now we're really up against it again. I know there are New Yorkers out there who love New York, who would love to be part of a visionary program like this.
You were telling me that some
Tell them to call you.
You were saying to me that some of these volunteers are wheelchair bound, blind. I mean,
and the visitors too. And there's no discrimination in this program.
There's absolutely no discrimination. But what's interesting is that these volunteers who take care of these people, spend at least 3 hours with
That's right.
And they show them a community. So, for example, if somebody, wants to see the South Bronx, they want to see, Arthur Avenue, they will meet with them at Arthur Avenue.
No, they'll meet with them the volunteer will meet the visitor in the visitor's hotel and then take them on the subway so that they can learn about public transportation up to Arthur Avenue. The volunteers, 99% of the time, meet the visitor in the visitor's hotel.
Now, does a volunteer spend more than 1 3-hour session with them? What's the situation?
They might. If you went on our website, there's an explanation that the expectation is 3 to 4 hours, and that's expectation on part of both the volunteer and the visitor. But sometimes there's kismet.
Right.
And they
want to spend more time.
And they want to, but that's a personal thing.
Let's talk about this award that you just won. Tell me about the article, which I've read, the organization, which I alluded to before, about the people over 55 continuing working.
Well, my son got this application in his office up in Rhode Island for people who have accomplished something in later life to enter a contest. Asked you to write about yourself and why you did something after the age of 55, and I was 59 when everybody told me I had lost my mind leaving a job that I had, that I would never get another job. But I didn't really believe that after 59 you couldn't do anything. So it's 20 years later. This big little idea that I had has become this worldwide organization.
How many greeters would you say are in the 36 different chapters?
Total number of greeters? Nobody's asked me that question, but
How many?
oh, it has to be at least 1,000. If we've got 300 in New York, I will find out the answer to that and let you know.
Now the other question is,
It's an interesting question.
how many people are greeted in New York each year?
We do about 700 individual people a month.
700 a month.
Oh, we've done
So
over
we-
120,000 people.
Let's talk a little bit about family. You've been married for a couple years to Stan Brooks.
I've been married for 59 years to Stan Brooks.
Okay.
20 years at Big Apple Greeter and 59 years with Stan Brooks,
Okay.
and they're both wonderful.
And you have 2 sons?
I have 3 sons.
3 sons. Okay, tell me about the sons and the grandchildren, because it's important that I always, when they watched.
Well, I have one son who works for the governor of Rhode Island in workforce development. He's the one who sent me the contest information. I have one son who's a musician. He plays the saxophone. The music he writes is American jazz, a fusion with Indian classical music. He's in India right now. And my third son works as a public policy mediator. And it's hard to explain what he does, but he will be hired maybe by government to, an easy one to explain, bring together, the people want water, the farmers need water in California, the cities need the water, and the environmentalists need the water. Well, bring them all together to the table and tell the Interior Department, who will hire his firm, what's the best policy? How do you bring all this? So it's a mediation kind of thing that he does.
So what
Grandchildren,
Yes.
I've got 3 grandchildren.
You better
in
name them. Because
3 grandchildren in California. From my musician son, I have 3 grandchildren living on the West Coast and the East Coast from my son in Rhode Island. And I have 1 happy granddaughter in New York City. So it's wonderful that at least one of my
Okay.
grandchildren live in New York City.
So I would like
And
to
2 great-grandchildren who live in Oregon.
So it's, it shows that people, if they have the tenacity and the desire, they can do anything. And
I think that's true.
And you had the desire to do a lot during your life, and especially to create Big Apple Greeter. And people should, what's the website of Big Apple Greeter?
Big Apple Greeter.
And take advantage of it. And thanks for
And
being.
please call me. I'd love to talk to you if you're interested.
The founder is still there.
The founder is definitely still there and planning to stay.
Okay, good. Thank you.